Me too.
If there's no comparable pending listings, then you can include a second active listing in lieu of a pending listing. So let's talk about what constitutes a comparable property. The appraisals, the appraisal goes off of plus or minus 15% on the square footage. Is a hard number. But if you get down to a 1,000 square foot property, you go plus or minus 15%. 150 feet is not going to give you many properties to consider. So I just have personally adopted an easy rule of thumb that for under 1,000 feet, I use plus or minus 200 square feet. For under 2,000 feet, I use plus or minus 300 square feet. For under 4,000, I use plus or minus 5. And then if I get into a bigger home, then I use the plus or minus 15%. Where I use that is like if I'm on the phone and someone calls in and tells me like, what do you think my property's worth? And I'm doing something quickly, I'm not going to pull out the calculator to be precise on the numbers. If we're just at a home and we're not like writing a contract and we're talking about in general, what do you think the home's worth? I use that rule of thumb. But if I'm actually going to put a CMA together and put my name on it, then I'm going to use the 15% and be more accurate at that point.
Morning. How are you?
Good.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. We're just halfway down the first page. We're just getting started.
Awesome.
So talking about different types of properties, we want to compare single-family homes to single-family homes, condos to condos, townhomes to townhomes. That's pretty straightforward. The question that comes up all the time is bedrooms. Okay, so the rule of thumb on bedrooms, compare a 2 to a 3, 3 to 4. You should never compare a 2 to a 3. You should only compare it to other 2 bedrooms. But a 3 is comparable to a 4 is comparable to a 5. And the reason is very simple. Statistics show the majority of 4th bedrooms aren't actually used as a bedroom. They're used as an office or a recreational space or some other space. Also, it's common for builders to have the same home layout option that could either be a 3 or a 4. So like when I'm doing, and so my own home is a perfect example of this. So when you walk into my home, there's a stairwell right there, and then a big open area that's like a great room with a dining and living, and then there's a master bedroom off to the left. You go upstairs, there's an open loft and 2 more bedrooms, so I have a 3-bedroom home. That same floor plan was built by the builder as a 4-bedroom option, where when you go up the stairs, instead of having an open loft, there's a 4th bedroom with no loft space. Well, that's pure preference of the buyer as to whether they wanted a 4th bedroom or whether they would prefer the loft. So a smaller family with less kids would rather have the recreational space that, you know, the kids can be upstairs playing video games with mom and dad or watching downstairs. If someone has more children, they might want the 4th bedroom. So the way I explain it to people is, Mr. Seller, if the next buyer that comes along with your house, if he's just as likely to not want this room as he is to want it, what value does that add to your house? Because that's what you'll run into is the person doing the listing will say, I have a 4-bedroom that's worth more than the person's next door. So you have to have a good answer for that question. It's going to come up a lot as to why that bedroom isn't necessarily worth more. And that's the 2 big reasons. Because predominantly it's just the choice, it's a preference of the buyer at that point. It doesn't add value to the house. Turn the page over. We talked about active, including an active and a pending. The fancy word is the principle of substitution. Underwriters want to see them because a potential buyer is likely not going to pay more than the list price of a nearby competing listing that is comparable. And this is especially true when the market is moving one way or the other. Right now we're in single-digit inflation. We don't have the big gains that we had 2 years ago. But when the market's moving down or market's moving up, properties that sold before may no longer be a good price because of the way the market's trending. So if there's an alternative option that someone can buy for less than what you're listing, your listing price might be well substantiated based off of solds, but the bottom line, if there's a more affordable home in the neighborhood, that's what the person's going to buy. And that's why we include the active as a point of reference. Can short sales or RUs be used in solds for traditional property? The short answer is maybe. And maybe is going to come up with a lot. Appraising or CMA, because we can't call it appraisal, right? Because we're not licensed appraisers. But a CMA is definitely an art form more so than a science. There are some hard and fast, like the plus or minus 15%, the 90 days. Those are pretty easy to establish. But a lot of it is going to come down to a personal decision. So if you're in a community and you want to know if you're going to include REOs, go back the last 6 months, see what percentage of the sales were REOs. If they were a driving factor in the market, then include them. If they were minority sales, then disclude them. What if you can't find any closed sales that occurred in the past 90 days in the subject neighborhood? The rule of thumb there is you can go out to a 1 mile radius. If you're still not finding comps that meet the threshold, you can go beyond that, but understand that your CMA's accuracy is questionable at that point. And some CMAs are going to be very easy, like we're talking about before you started, and some are, the comps are going to be a little bit harder to come up with, and I'm going to give you strategy at the end for how to address that if you have a property that's just really hard to come up with a CMA. The moment you go outside the home, and this is important, an appraiser now needs 6 comps instead of 5.
After you go out of how long?
Out of the neighborhood.
Okay.
So when you go into adjoining neighborhoods, you're no longer in the same neighborhood, you need to double your amount of comps to have what's considered accurate.
Can I ask a question right
Of course, yeah.
For instance, if we're talking about this type of community where few different models, and some models are more desirable, some less desirable, would you recommend when we're doing a CMA compare model to model, like apples to apples, like cherries to cherries?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you have the same model, if you have a cookie cutter neighborhood where the model repeats itself,
right?
I would preference the same model, even if I have to go back further and ignore some recent sales. But bear in mind, these guidelines are a minimum of what you have to have an accurate appraisal. So you could include both, or you could include just similar models, and it depends on what your goal is. And that's a good point to bring in this point right here, because this is an art, not a science.
Right.
We have to remember our duty to our client. So if you're taking a listing, your duty is to help them sell that home, right? So if that home is priced lower than other homes in the neighborhood, is it more likely or less likely to sell?
More likely.
So if you help them to value their home lower to make it more sellable, have you done your client a service to help them sell it? Yeah.
Yes.
Now, if you're on the other side of the table, if you're representing the buyer, and they're putting in an offer, it's a multiple offer situation. If their offer is higher, are they more likely to get that home? Yes. So using your exact example, I would run it both ways. I would run just the same model, and then I would take, if there's other models that are still within the 15%, so they're still considered comp, but they're a different model, and run it that way, and see whether that gives me a higher price or a lower price. And then if I am trying to take the listing, and I'm representing the seller, and I want him to get a lower price that's more likely to get him to sell, I'm going to present the one that substantiates the lower price. If I'm on the other side of the table representing the buyer and I'm trying to get him to up his offer to have a better chance of having that accepted, then I'm going to present the one that supports that. And I don't feel in any way that I'm being unfair, and I'm certainly not being unethical in doing that, because the buyer wants to buy the home, the seller wants to sell the home, and it's my job to help them accomplish that goal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you compare an older home to one that's been updated or renovated? You get this a lot here in Delaney Park. You get it in Thornton Park, where there's big price differences between the older ones and the renovated homes. The best thing you can possibly do is just find another renovated comp. So start with your search in the last 90 days, but that's where you're always going to have to get into the individual properties and look at the properties. You have not done a good CMA if you just pull up ones that are in 15%. Well, they're within 15%, so they're comparable. So go into the individual ones, and in this case, if you're in Delaney Park here and you have a nicely renovated home, and you pull up the last 3 sales, and 2 are renovated and 1 is not renovated, I would just discount the unrenovated one. Go back, like we said, you can go back up to 6 months for your third one if you need to and find another renovated one. And here's why. We talked about there's some hard rules and there's some things that are subjective. The hard rule is 10% is the maximum adjustment to comparable. It's allowed on appraisal. If you have to adjust a comp by more than 10%, it's not a comp. You need to find one that is. So in a market average home, our market average home is what, $180,000, right? 183 to be precise. So 10% on an average home is going to cap you at $18,000 that you could adjust it for renovations. Could you spend over $18,000 renovating a home? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you only compare it against a non-renovated home, your maximum allowed adjustment may not be sufficient to take into account what they spent on the renovations. So just keep looking and find a renovated home to compare it against.
Excuse me. Hmm? How about years? How old the home is?
For the most part, with Delaney Park kind of being an exception, when you're in the same subdivision, you're going to be within very, very close in the model year. Mm-hmm. So that's rarely a factor. I personally never make an adjustment for it. Kelly says to make an adjustment. She doesn't say what it is. So that's one of those more subjective things. I mean, if you were in, I guess the only place that would come in would be in College Park, where it's not uncommon to have a level and rebuild. So now if you're comparing new construction to 1950s construction, that would be a case where I might go further back or further out to find new construction in College Park so that I can compare new to new. And that'd be a better way of trying to price for it than it would be to try to adjust the value of an older home. Yeah. What about one-story and two-story dwellings? This is like the example I gave before of that home that could be built out either as a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom. It's personal preference. Some buyers want the second story because they want the kids to be upstairs where they don't bother them. Some people, especially the elderly, like the split floor plan. So if the next buyer that comes along is just as likely to hate the second story as to like the second story, does it add any value to the home? No. And that's how you explain it to people. Because some people think their home is worth more or worth less because of the levels or because of the layout. And this all comes down to how you explain it to the seller or to your buyer to justify how you're arriving at this price. And that's what I want to kind of try to include a little bit too. This is not just about coming up with a number. It's about justifying your number and your rationale to help them respect your number. Particularly when you're doing a listing presentation and someone has come along and told them they'll give them $20,000, $30,000 more for their house just to get the listing, even though they're never going to get that price and it's not realistic. That's where the explanation of how you arrive at your price is possibly more important than even the price itself. So, and that's why I don't just give sellers a CMA. I actually walk them through how I arrive at the CMA. So I always bring a hard copy because at some point the laptop always crashes. But I always like to open up the laptop and actually walk them through the process of how I arrived at that. And I have had sellers say, you know, so-and-so came in and told me it's worth $30,000 more, but I don't believe them after, you know, seeing what you're showing me. And I'm like, oh, I'm just trying to be honest with you. So, and they will respect honesty if you establish it. Now, if you only go in there and tell them their home's worth $30,000 less than the last guy that came in, they're going to list with the other guy.
Excuse me, I have another question. I'm so sorry.
No.
Why then does it tend to be that a lot of two-story houses are more expensive than just a one-story if it is just in fact just because some people's preference, whether they have a one-story or a two-story?
Which two-story homes are you talking about? Like what neighborhoods?
Like in South Orlando, like the Sawgrass area, Weatherby area. Mm-hmm. I know that there's some two-story homes that are more expensive than just the one-story home.
Okay, I'm not familiar with Sawgrass, but in general I would say it's two reasons. First, two-story homes usually have more square footage, so they're probably not more expensive per square foot. They're probably comparable on that regard. And there's very few two-story homes in Orlando, and it's primarily newer construction that's two stories. So all of our older homes are 1970s homes with the aluminum wiring. Those are all single level, so you won't find many old two-story homes.
So it's just the square footage?
This is square footage.
Okay.
Yeah. This is all about price per square foot. And that's what you have to help your clients understand is the importance of price per square foot. They're never going to see that. They're looking on Zillow at so-and-so's home sold down the street. And that's why I opened with tying it all back to the whole reason that CMAs work, for those of you guys that stepped in late. The whole reason the CMAs work in the first place is that the majority of loans are sold to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. So you have two players that drive the appraisal standards and set the standards, and that's why there's so much consistency. And that's where you have to explain to your clients, they're looking at so-and-so's home down the street and say, but hey, that home's not within 15% of your square footage. So when Joe Buyer comes and puts an offer on your home, and the bank decides if they're going to offer a loan for that person to buy your home, that home's not going to be considered. And you have to kind of walk them through the appraisal process and how that works and help them understand that that home does not affect their value because it's not a comp. Concrete block versus frame. This comes up very seldom, but I just included it because Kelly talked about it. Her rule of thumb is not to make any adjustment for homes constructed after 1980 because the construction standards changed, and at that point the frame homes are more comparable in quality to the ones to the block. But for the ones prior to 1980 were built to less workmanship. So, and we've kind of already hinted at this several times, if you have a neighborhood of mixed construction of block and frame, and you're trying to do a CMA on a frame home and compare it to other solds, what would be the easiest way to get the value of that frame home? Just find other frame homes. Just don't compare it to a block. Yeah. She says to make an adjustment. She again doesn't say what the adjustment is conveniently, and that's why it's just easier to keep searching and find a more comparable home. So speaking of adjustments, so we always make the adjustments on the comparable property, never on the subject property. And the simple rule that I remember is superior subtract, inferior increase. So if you're selling a home with a pool and you do your CMA and you come up with a home that doesn't have a pool, that would not be a good reason to throw out that home and say it's not a comp. That would be a perfect example of a price of just one to adjust the price. And so since it's inferior from our listing in that it doesn't have a pool, we would just simply add in the value of the pool. And so since we're talking about adjustments, we'll make the detour to Kelly's adjustment guideline sheet here. So I've got two guidelines from two different appraisers. They're fairly consistent with each other. Both of them have given a couple of price buckets for their adjustments. So like on Kelly's sheet here with her little logo, the second one down from open pool, for a $125,000 home, she adjusts between $6,000 and $10,000. But for a $500,000 home, she adjusts between $10,000 on the low end and $20,000 on the high. And that just makes perfect sense because someone in a $500,000 home is probably putting in a much nicer pool than someone living in a $125,000 home. So they're probably investing more in the pool. She gives a range for each one. I just take the middle, personally.
I was just going to ask, what's that range? There's a $10,000 range in that.
Yeah, so, I mean, the range is nice in that, let's say that it's not just a pool, but she has, your seller has the paver decking, and they've incorporated some built-in benches and a waterfall and those kind of features, versus a pool that has a flat concrete. So that's why Kelly gives the range. But for the most part, if I have a listing that has a pool, I just add the two, divide by two, and take the average right in the middle. And so again, you would make these adjustments strictly to the comp, not to your subject home. And then we'll walk through CMA and we'll do that. How to adjust for site influences. For example, they would be an up adjustment if there's a lake view, or a down adjustment if they're by power lines or railroads. So she gives 3 methods for doing this. One, which would be in my opinion, the least accurate, is just to simply take a paired sale. So if house A, and you're comparing it to house B, and house A sold for $250,000, and house B on the pond sold for $275,000, then apparently the value of the pond added $25,000 to house B. But rarely is it going to be that simple, because is house B really going to be 100% identical to house A, other than the fact that it was on the pool? So in my opinion, the next method is more accurate to go into regression analysis, which is the same principle as number 1, except that you just take a bigger sample. So ideally, if you take 2, 3, or 4 houses that sold off the water in that community, and you compare them to houses that sold on the water, and then you take the averages, you're going to have a more accurate calculation of the effect of the water without it being influenced by variances in the home. And bear in mind, you don't have to, since this is an average, and maybe this is obvious, but it doesn't have to be quid pro quo. You might have 4 houses off the water and take the average of those, and have 3 that sold on the water. You don't have to have 4 that sold on the water just because you have 4, because you're just taking the average per square foot, effectively. And then third would be builder's premium. If there is new construction in the area, find out what the builders in that area are charging the premium for lake lots, and that's usually a good indication of what it's worth. So here's another great real-life example when we talk about the art versus the science and making it appropriate to your client. So I have a buyer early this year in Baldwin Park looking at homes, and some of the homes in Baldwin, particularly on the northeast side of the lake, have this Spanish tile roofs. You guys know those, right? Mm-hmm. So 2 to 3 times the cost of a regular roof, 4 to 5 times the lifespan. So instead of a $15,000 roof, we're talking a $30,000 plus roof with a 75-year lifespan instead of a 15-year lifespan. Clearly a more valuable roof. Except that, based on what we would say like the builder's cost or comparable sales in other communities, but not in Baldwin Park, because the only houses that have that are the Mediterranean style ones that it just looked right for the house. Therefore, David Weekley Homes charged no premium for this much more expensive roof. So you have 2 ways of looking at the value of the roof. You have the value of the roof, and you have the builder's premium. So if you're representing the seller trying to list this home and you want to help them sell the home, which of those 2 would you point at to establish the value of it?
The builder isn't charging any more.
The builder didn't charge anything. It doesn't add anything because, and you could justify that reasonably based on that.
Will the seller want you to base it on that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the seller, that's what I'm saying. The seller is probably going to say, hey, I got this Spanish roof that's worth twice as much. It's got a much longer roof. It should add value to my home. If they are overvaluing their home to the point where it may not sell because of that, that might be the item that helps you bring them to a price that's going to help them sell their home. And again, you're trying to help them accomplish what it is that they are ultimately wanting to do themselves. But then let's say you represent the buyer, which I did in this case, and this home was a little bit on the pricey side, despite the fact that it didn't have the Spanish style roofs. So then, which obviously what would you emphasize regarding the value of the roof? Is that, well, the other side of the equation. And both of those are true. So that's where the subjectivity comes in this process, and that's where you have to adapt the valuation to what the needs of your client are. Difficult cases, lakefront or acreage, we're talking like 1 to 5 or more acres. The guideline from the book is you could search up to 6 miles instead of 1 mile, and you're still considered to be an acceptable radius. Anytime you get over an acre of property, you're allowed to go out further. And then for larger homes that comprise less than 5% of our market, we're talking like homes over 6,000 square feet, the appraiser is allowed to search the entire county to get comps. But so let's talk about now when you get a home that defies appraisal. So I had a listing presentation just in the last 2 months, and I'm just calling off of expired listings, and I get them on the phone and they're interested in talking, and then I get to actually look up the property because I'm using a dialer, so I haven't seen it, and then I start looking at it and I'm like, holy hell. I wish I had not called this number. Okay. So they're in Davenport. They're on 5 acres of property. They have a 3,000 square foot home, but they also have a 4-bay commercial garage. She could do like auto work, or in his case, he was repairing RVs. 2 large storage units, 3 mobile homes that are paying lot rent. So now, in a community surrounded by small lot, single mobile homes. So I go out a mile, and the only comps that I have is a single mobile home on a small lot against a 3,000 square foot home on a 5 acre lot. So here's what I did, and this has worked pretty well. I said, Mr. Seller, there's two issues here. One is me bringing you a contract. And I was like, I can do that. That's not a problem. Here's the problem. The problem is the bank approving the loan for the person that buys that home. Just because I put a contract in front of you and you're happy for the price doesn't mean this home is going to sell for that price. It's got to get past the appraiser. I don't think this valuation of what you want for your home is going to get past the appraiser. I think we're wasting our time. I was like, but this is a very complicated property and I could be wrong. So here's what I would do for you. I will reimburse the cost of an appraisal at closing if you get an appraisal up front, so that we know that we are not wasting our time listing this property for more than it will appraise for. And not only that, once we have that, we can actually attach it to the MLS listing to show that we have strong support for this price, because this is an unusual property and the buyer's agents are going to have a hard time advising their buyer what it's worth. So when we attach it to the MLS attachments, that shows, hey, this is a valid price for this property. It's going to appraise. It's going to be able to close. He says, that sounds like a great idea. We got an appraisal. The appraiser came back, his valuation's insane. He wanted $350, the appraisal came back at $250. If I took that listing at $350, I would have taken the time to do photos, taken the time to do PR, and it would have been a waste of time. If I actually found someone that's crazy enough to buy that property, it wouldn't have closed anyway. It would have just been a big hassle for nothing. So in the end, I didn't take the listing because he was adamant about the $350. And that's my personal rule of thumb, is I don't take listings just to inflate my stats, because I don't want to waste the time if it's not actually a viable sellable property. But it didn't cost me anything to find out that it was never going to happen, because he paid for the appraisal. And since the property never closed, I didn't owe anything for it. So, yeah. So if you get into this unusual Frankenstein property that defies appraisals, that's my personal standard approach.
Did that seller add all of those things after he purchased that property?
Yeah, he had the house, and then he built the garages almost immediately because he had a mobile home business. And then he had one of them was a family member, and then he moved some other people on there. So
were those people going to stay?
Yeah, they were all on leases. So what I did on that property, this is before I gave up and turned it over to the appraisal. Let's say that he just adamantly refused to do the appraisal. So in that particular case, remember there's more than one way to value a property. So you can value it based on solds, but you can also value it as an investment property. So I took the value of the rentals and then put it into a return on investment spreadsheet that I have. And so it just says for the purchase price, if it generates this much rent. So then what I did was the value of the leases that were already there in the mobile home, and then I went and found what a home that size would lease for in that area, and just calculated it as if someone just bought the property exclusively as an investment, rented out everything. And it actually came out slightly higher that way than it did as a single-family home.
It took a lot of thinking from you to evaluate that property.
That was a thorn. Like I said, I would not have called on that property if the dialer didn't call.
Right.
Yeah, then the details came up. I was like, oh,
that's like too much thinking.
I wish he hadn't answered the phone. But I mean, if he was realistic about what he wanted to sell it for, I would happily have taken a listing. But here's the best part, though. He has another property, a lake home, that because I came to him and I was honest with him that your property's not going to sell for this, here's why, and I explained it to him, he now wants me to list his lake home that's more straightforward, that is actually a sellable property. So you never know. I'm about to list a home in Altamont that he wanted to list his investment property, is how it came across him, expired investment property. He was overvalued. I was honest with him that he was overvalued, and he listed anyway, came down on his price, took 2 offers. Neither one has closed yet because of inspection problems, but quickly took 2 offers. He calls me out of the blue and says, I'm interested in selling my